Before doctrines hardened into creeds, before orthodoxy drew its borders in fire and ink, there stood a shadowed figure at the crossroads of miracle and heresy. His name was Simon Magus, and to some, he was the first great enemy of Christian truth. To others, something far more unsettling, a visionary who claimed to possess the power of God himself. The ancient world into which Simon emerged was one of spiritual volatility. Judea and Samaria simmered with messianic expectation. Greek philosophy mingled with Eastern mysticism. And magic was not a superstition. It was a technology of the sacred. In this charged atmosphere, Simon rose to prominence as a thaumaturge, a wonder worker whose acts were said to astonish crowds and command devotion. According to early Christian sources, he did not merely perform miracles. He taught that he was the divine power made manifest. The book of Acts introduces him briefly but ominously, a man who astonished the people of Samaria and was called the Great Power of God. This title is not incidental. It hints at a radical theological claim, one that would later echo through the halls of Gnosticism, that divinity could descend, inhabit flesh, and be known through secret knowledge rather than obedience or faith alone. Yet Simon's story is not preserved by his own hand. Everything we know comes filtered through his enemies, church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus of Lyons, and Hippolytus of Rome. They paint him as the archetypal heretic, the fountainhead from which all Gnostic error flowed. But history, especially sacred history, is rarely so simple. Was Simon merely a charlatan intoxicated by his own myth? Or was he articulating a spiritual cosmology that threatened the emergent church precisely because it rivaled its authority? His teachings, fragmentary, distorted yet persistent, speak of emanations, divine pairs, fallen wisdom, and liberation through knowledge, themes that would later define entire Gnostic systems. In this opening chapter, we stand at the threshold, not to judge, but to listen, to peel back centuries of polemic and ask a forbidden question. What if Simon Magus was not just a heretic, but a prototype? In the sections that follow, we descend deeper into his myth, his doctrine, and the quiet war he sparked between magic and miracle, knowledge and faith, control and awakening. To understand Simon Magus is not to begin with spectacle, but with structure. Beneath the accusations of trickery and arrogance preserved by the Church Fathers lies a coherent, if radical, cosmology, one that does not merely challenge early Christianity, but quietly redefines what salvation itself means. According to Irenaeus of Lyons, Simon taught that behind the visible world stood an ineffable, unknowable source, the boundless power. This supreme reality did not rule through commandments or laws, but through emanation, unfolding itself into existence through successive expressions of being. Here, we encounter a concept that would later become foundational to Gnosticism. The idea that creation is not a single divine act, but a cascading fall from unity into multiplicity. At the heart of Simon's system was Ennoia, divine thought. She was the first emanation of the boundless power, a feminine principle through whom all things were conceived. Yet Ennoia did not remain in the heights. According to the myth, she descended into the lower realms and became trapped within matter, fragmented across human existence, subjected to cycles of suffering, incarnation, and forgetfulness. This is where Simon's theology becomes incendiary. He claimed that Ennoia had appeared repeatedly throughout history, first as Helen of Troy, later as other women whose beauty became both their power and their curse. In Simon's own time, he identified her incarnation as Helen of Tyre, a woman he reportedly redeemed from slavery and proclaimed as the fallen divine thought herself. To Orthodox ears, this was blasphemy layered upon scandal. But within Simon's framework, it was revelation. Humanity, he taught, was not sinful by nature. It was enslaved by ignorance. The rulers of this world, often identified with angels or cosmic powers, maintained control by keeping humanity unaware of its divine origin. Salvation, therefore, was not forgiveness. It was remembrance. Simon positioned himself as the revealer, the embodiment of the boundless power who descended to awaken Ennoia and liberate the divine sparks scattered throughout humanity. His role mirrors what later Gnostic texts would attribute to Christ, but with one crucial difference. Simon did not submit to suffering or death. According to hostile sources, he denied the reality of the crucifixion altogether, claiming that divine beings cannot truly suffer. Here we begin to see why Simon was intolerable to the emerging church. His cosmology undermined authority at every level. If divine power could incarnate repeatedly, then Jesus was not unique. If salvation came through knowledge rather than faith, then bishops were unnecessary. If the world was shaped by lesser powers, then obedience to worldly systems, religious or political, was a form of bondage. Simon did not offer a church. He offered initiation, not repentance, but awakening. And in doing so, he laid the conceptual foundations for movements that would flourish long after his name was condemned. What survives of Simon's teachings may be fragmentary, distorted by enemies, and refracted through polemic, but the architecture is unmistakable. A hidden God, a fallen wisdom, a world built on illusion, and a Redeemer who comes not to rule, but to reveal. Every myth needs a collision. For Simon Magus, it came not in the form of a king or an empire, but an apostle. The book of Acts stages the encounter like a theological duel. Miracle versus magic, humility versus hubris, divine gift versus purchased power. But beneath the surface, this confrontation reveals something far more unsettling. Two rival visions of spiritual authority struggling to define the future. According to Acts of the Apostles, Simon was baptized after witnessing the works of Peter the Apostle and the other disciples. At first glance, it appears to be a conversion story, but the tension surfaces quickly. When Simon sees the apostles imparting the Holy Spirit through the laying on of hands, he offers them money, asking to acquire this power for himself. Peter's response is thunderous. He condemns Simon, declaring that the gift of God cannot be bought, and warns him that his heart is not right before God. From this episode comes the term simony, the sin of purchasing spiritual authority. For centuries, this scene has been read as a simple moral lesson, but many scholars suspect something deeper is at work. Simon's request may not have been greed, but misunderstanding. In the magical worldview of the ancient Mediterranean, spiritual power was transferable, taught, initiated, unlocked through knowledge and technique. Simon was operating within a different metaphysical grammar altogether. To Peter, divine power was bestowed solely by God, mediated through chosen vessels, and inseparable from obedience. To Simon, power was intrinsic, latent within the cosmos and the self, waiting to be activated through revelation. This was not merely a clash of personalities. It was a war over how the sacred itself functions. After this confrontation, Simon vanishes from the biblical narrative, but not from history. Church tradition claims he traveled to Rome, where he allegedly performed wonders, levitated before crowds, and even competed with Peter for influence at the heart of the empire. Some accounts describe a dramatic finale, Simon attempting to fly, only to fall to his death after Peter's prayers break his power. Yet these stories bear the marks of legend rather than record. They read less like history and more like theological propaganda, morality plays designed to reassure believers that heresy, no matter how dazzling, always collapses. What is far more telling is that Simon's ideas did not die, they multiplied. Multiple early Christian writers insist that Simon was the fountainhead of all Gnostic movements. Whether this is historically accurate or rhetorically convenient remains debated, but the pattern is clear. Valentinus, the Basilides, and other later teachers echo Simonian themes. Emanations, divine pairs, ignorance as bondage, knowledge as salvation. Even when Simon's name was erased, his architecture remained. This is the true threat Simon represented. Not false miracles, but a competing interpretation of Christ. One in which Jesus was not a singular savior, but a revealer among many. One in which authority flowed upward from awakening individuals, not downward from institutional hierarchy. It is here, in this unresolved tension, that the early church draws its line. Magic must be severed from miracle. Knowledge must submit to faith, and revelation must be centralized, or it will fracture endlessly. If you're finding these fault lines between orthodoxy and hidden knowledge as compelling as they were dangerous, this is where the labyrinth truly begins. Consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment with your thoughts. Was Simon a corrupter of truth, or a mirror the church could not afford to face? In the next section, we'll follow the ripple effects of Simon's legacy, how his ideas mutated, survived, and quietly shaped the forbidden traditions that history tried to bury. Heresy rarely vanishes. It mutates, migrates, and learns to survive under new names. If Simon Magus was truly defeated, if his fall marked the end of his influence, then the centuries that followed should have been silent. Instead, they are loud with echoes. Early church writers insist that Simon did not die with his legend. They speak of disciples, successors, and sects, collectively known as the Simonians, who carried his teachings across the Roman world. Whether these groups were directly organized by Simon himself or retroactively labeled by his enemies matters less than the pattern that emerges. Ideas attributed to Simon reappear again and again at the heart of early Gnostic thought. According to Hippolytus of Rome, Simon's followers preserve a secret text called the Great Declaration, a work now lost but partially quoted by hostile sources. Within it, Simon is said to describe himself not merely as a teacher, but as the standing manifestation of divine power, appearing in different forms across history to liberate the imprisoned Ennoia. This concept of a recurring revealer would later resurface in multiple Gnostic systems, where Christ is less a singular event and more an eternal function. From Simon, the line allegedly passes to figures like Menander of Antioch, who taught that baptism in his name granted immortality, and that the world was governed by angelic powers hostile to humanity. These rulers, proto-archons, would become central villains in later Gnostic cosmologies. Whether Menander was truly Simon's student or a theological descendant, the continuity is striking. By the mid-2nd century, thinkers such as Valentinus articulated sophisticated systems of emanations, divine syzygies, and cosmic falls, concepts that align uncannily with Simonian themes. The language is more refined, the mythology more elaborate, but the core intuition remains unchanged. The material world is not the creation of the highest God, and salvation lies in awakening from deception. The Church Fathers responded by drawing a straight line from Simon to every later deviation. This was not accidental. By positioning Simon as the father of heresies, Orthodoxy could frame all alternative Christianities as corrupt branches from a single poisoned root. It was a powerful rhetorical strategy, one that simplified a complex spiritual landscape into a battle between truth and error. But modern scholarship paints a more nuanced picture. Many historians now argue that Gnosticism did not originate from a single figure, but from a shared cultural matrix: Platonic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, Persian dualism, and Hellenistic magic, all converging in the first centuries of the Common Era. In this view, Simon becomes less an originator and more a crystallization point, a figure who embodied tensions already present in the world around him. Still, symbolism matters. Simon's myth became a template: the dangerous teacher, the self-declared divine revealer, the one who bypasses institutions and speaks directly to the soul. These archetypes haunted the church long after Simon himself faded into legend. What made Simonian thought so resilient was not its structure, but its promise. It told seekers that they were not broken, merely asleep, that the world's cruelty was not ordained by God, but engineered by lesser powers, and that within each human being lay a fragment of the divine waiting to be remembered. This message could not be easily extinguished. It survived in underground texts, secret initiations, and whispered teachings. It resurfaced in movements labeled heretical, mystical, or dangerous, not because they lacked coherence, but because they threatened control. By the time the canon was sealed and doctrine enforced, Simon had already won a quiet victory. His name became a warning, but his ideas became unavoidable. Even in opposition, the Church was forced to define itself against him. In the next section, we will step back and confront the most unsettling question of all. Not whether Simon influenced Gnosticism, but whether the boundary between heresy and orthodoxy was ever as clear as history pretends. By the time Simon Magus became a symbol of everything Christianity opposed, something crucial had already happened. The faith of fishermen and wandering teachers had begun its transformation into an institution. And institutions, by necessity, must decide who speaks for God and who does not. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, there was no single Christianity. There were many. Competing gospels circulated, rival interpretations of Jesus flourished, and communities disagreed not only on doctrine, but on the nature of reality itself. Some believed the world was fundamentally good, a creation to be redeemed. Others, those later branded Gnostic, saw it as a trap, a distortion, a prison constructed by lesser powers. Simon's teachings, whether directly or indirectly, fed into this second current. Labeling Simon a heretic was not merely a theological judgment, it was a political act. By framing him as the archetypal false teacher, the emerging church could define its own boundaries in contrast. Orthodoxy was not discovered. It was constructed, shaped through councils, condemnations, and exclusions. The charge against Simon was not only that he taught error, but that he claimed authority without permission. He did not trace his power through apostolic succession. He did not submit to communal oversight. He spoke as one who had seen, not one who had been appointed. This alone made him intolerable. Ironically, many of the traits condemned in Simon mirror those attributed to Jesus in earlier traditions. A wandering teacher, a miracle worker, a revealer of hidden truths, a figure whose authority unsettled religious elites. The difference lay not in method, but in outcome. Jesus became the foundation of a church. Simon became its shadow. The concept of heresy itself deserves scrutiny. The Greek word heresis originally meant choice or school of thought. Only later did it become synonymous with deviation and danger. In this light, Simonian teaching was not an invasion from outside Christianity. It was one option among many, competing to define what the message of Christ truly meant. When orthodoxy solidified, complexity became a liability. Mystical ambiguity had to be replaced with clear doctrine. Personal revelation had to submit to authorized interpretation. Knowledge had to yield to faith. Simon's worldview, fluid, initiatory, resistant to control, was incompatible with a faith that now sought unity across empire. This does not mean the Church acted in bad faith. From its perspective, unregulated revelation threatened fragmentation. A religion that allowed every visionary equal authority would dissolve into chaos. The suppression of figures like Simon was, in part, an attempt to preserve coherence, but preservation came at a cost. Entire cosmologies were erased. Alternative readings of Jesus were buried, and the question of whether salvation was about obedience or awakening was quietly settled by power rather than consensus. Simon Magus stands at the fault line of this decision. His condemnation marks the moment when Christianity chose order over multiplicity, creed over mystery, hierarchy over initiation. Whether this choice was necessary or tragic depends on where one stands. What cannot be denied is this: once Simon was declared the enemy, the rules of the game were set. To know God without mediation became suspect. To claim inner divinity became dangerous, and to speak of hidden knowledge became grounds for exile. In the final section, we will return to Simon not as a heretic or hero, but as a mirror. What his story reveals is not just the origins of Gnosticism, but an enduring human struggle between authority and awakening, control and consciousness. When the dust of accusation settles and the legends are stripped of their theatrics, Simon Magus remains less a villain than a reflection, not of error alone, but of a question Christianity never fully resolved. Who has the right to speak for the divine? Simon's life, as preserved through hostile witnesses, exposes a tension that still hums beneath modern spirituality. Is truth something granted from above through authority, or something awakened from within through experience? Is salvation an act of obedience, or an act of remembering? To the early church, Simon represented chaos, a man who blurred the boundary between God and human, miracle and magic, revelation and self-assertion. He threatened not only doctrine, but structure. If divine power could be accessed through knowledge, initiation, or inner awakening, then hierarchy became optional. And that possibility was far more dangerous than any false miracle. Yet Simon's vision, however distorted by polemic, refused to die because it spoke to something perennial. The intuition that the world is not as it seems. That suffering is not the final truth. That within the human being lies a forgotten spark of something vast, ancient, and luminous. Orthodoxy chose containment. It chose stability, continuity, and centralized meaning. And in doing so, it preserved a faith capable of spanning centuries and civilizations. But in the shadows of that success, other voices were silenced, voices that spoke in myth, symbol, and paradox rather than creed. Simon became the cautionary tale, the name invoked whenever knowledge dared to outrun permission. And yet, every resurgence of mysticism, every challenge to spiritual monopoly, every seeker who asks whether truth must always come with an institution, reawakens the Simonian question. Not because Simon was right in every claim, but because the struggle he embodied never ended. Perhaps this is his true legacy. Not a doctrine, not a sect, not a heresy, but a fault line. One that runs through religion itself. On one side, order, authority, and preservation. On the other, awakening, danger, and the uncontrollable fire of insight. The Church won the argument of history. But history does not end arguments. It buries them until they are ready to be asked again. If this exploration stirred something, if Simon feels less like a villain and more like a mirror, consider subscribing to Labyrinth of the Veiled and sharing your perspective in the comments. These stories endure because they are unfinished, and your interpretation becomes part of their afterlife. In the end, Simon Magus stands where he always has, at the threshold, asking not for belief, but for awareness.